and welcome back to my channel. Today I will be discussing a topic that is so frequently requested of me, and up until recently I have not really felt comfortable in doing it, but I now feel like I'm in a place where I can talk about very objectively, as much as I can, the history of Mormonism. And I've decided to just start with some of the more tricky subjects, and the first is plural marriage, or polygamy and polyandry in the early church. Now, I'd like to add some disclaimers before I begin. This is not anti-Mormon literature. It is not. My primary source for this video will actually be the LDS published plural marriage paper that was published a few years ago. It can be found on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.org. No, sorry, the Church of Jesus Christ.org, under the gospel topic essays. Now, alongside this source, I am using some historical sources, such as the biographies from the women that were married to Joseph Smith. So their first-hand accounts of the women, and you can piece together the experiences of the women and the situation via their first-hand accounts. And a third source that I'm using in a couple of instances are the first-hand accounts or letters that were sent to the plural wives from their previous husbands prior to them being married to Smith, and also some other historical records and some scholarly literature that has been done on the topic. So again, this is not anti-Mormon literature. I'm not going to be bashing any ideals. I'm simply displaying, or putting in one place, I suppose, the history. Now, before I start as well, I'd like to just preface that if you're a believing member, if you're a believing Mormon, I hope that this video is just as accessible and just as palatable as if you are an ex-Mormon, if you are a progressive Mormon, or if you've just never even heard of the term polygamy or Joseph Smith in your life. So yeah, I'm going to keep it as, what's the word, objective. I'm just going to try to keep it as objective as I can and not sort of throw in my own opinions as much as possible. So without further ado, let's get the video started and cue the music. All right, so if you are unfamiliar, Mormonism was founded by a man named Joseph Smith in the United States in the 1800s. He founded the church, and I'll do a separate video on the entire findings and the actual history behind the founding of the Mormon church. There's a whole nother conversation. In this video, I'm actually going to be talking about well after he had founded the church, closer to his death. He died by being shot while he was in prison. So this period of time in which I'm going to be talking about is sort of much later in the development of the Mormon church. So to begin with, Joseph had one wife. Her name was Emma Hale. Now, she was the daughter of Isaac and Elizabeth Hale, and they were married in 1827 in the Shenango County of New York. Now, there are records that Emma's parents were not fond of the idea of her marriage to Smith, and that is kind of just an ad-lib. It's pretty well documented as well that Joseph Smith's polygamy and polyandry was something that Emma did not know about. It was, there was a lot of secrecy behind the practice, and because of this secrecy, it's actually hard for us historically to know exactly how many wives Smith actually had. It's said that the higher estimates are up to about 40 women, but we know from Mormon historian Todd Compton that he at least was married to 33 women, and at least 1/3 of those women were simultaneously married to other men, and that term is polyandry. So to sort of set the scene for those that are unfamiliar, Joseph Smith believed himself to be a prophet who received revelation directly from God, and he was setting up a church that was, in his words, the restoration of Christ's church. So at this point in time, he was receiving revelations and documenting those alongside him receiving them. Now, he received a revelation where he believed that God told him that he needed to take on multiple wives. Now, Emma was alerted of this revelation and her personal struggles with the plural marriage, both during the time and post-martyrdom, are very well documented and well known in history. But the story of the actual plural wives are less understood or less known about, but we do have historical records talking about that. So I'm going to be kind of going through this timeline with the LDS plural marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo Gospel Essay, and kind of just breaking it down historically from there. So let's just begin. Again, I'll link this link in the bio to this video. It is a church published article. Just making sure you know it's not anti-Mormon literature. Okay, so Latter-day Saints believe that monogamy, which is the marriage between one man and one woman, is the Lord's standing law of marriage. Even though in the church plural marriages or polygamy are still practiced for widowers or men and women who are civilly divorced. So that means because the church believes in sealing after death, even if a wife is to die, a man can take on another wife eternally. It does not reverse the other way around. So if a woman has a husband that dies, she cannot take on a second husband because she's already sealed to her first husband. So the article goes on, in biblical times, the Lord commanded some of his people to practice plural marriage, the marriage of one man and more than one woman. So there's a footnote here that refers to Doctrine and Covenants 132, 24-39, which states that God commanded Abraham to sleep with Hagar, his wife's handmaiden. But according to the Bible, it was Abraham's wife, Sarah, not God, who told Abraham to take her handmaiden so that Abraham would be able to bear children, as she was not able to. In Genesis 16, 1-3 in the King James Version, nowhere in the Bible are men commanded by God to take plural wives, with the one possibility and potential exception of Hosea, which was not really anything like what was implemented in 1820 or 1830. The Book of Mormon author Jacob strongly condemns the practice of polygamy, and specifically uses David and Solomon and characterizes the practice as an abomination before God, and that can be found in Jacob 2:24. So Jacob did allow for, I suppose, a loophole, if you will, for if I will, saith the Lord of hosts, raise up seed to me, I command my people, otherwise they shall hearken unto these things. So this is a Book of Mormon quote, please. Further to this, in Leviticus 18, it forbids marrying a mother and her daughter, and marrying sisters. And this is important because, well, we can see that Joseph Smith did do this. So Leviticus 18 forbids this. So the Bible does not support the marriage of a man to more than one wife. So some members of the early Mormon church believed that they received this revelation. Now, after receiving the revelation commanding Joseph Smith, in his words, to practice plural marriage, this revelation was not recorded until after his death in 1843, which was approximately 10 years after his first plural marriage that was performed in secret. So Joseph Smith married up to 40. We don't know that factually, but at least 33 women. So yeah, he married a minimum of 33 wives, potentially up to 40. We can't conclusively say that though, because the practice was kept secret. Now, the principle was among the most challenging aspects of the early restoration of Mormonism and the early setup of the church. That's pretty self-explanatory. The article goes on to say, although the Lord commanded the adoption, according to Smith, the latter cessation of plural marriage in the latter days, he did not give exact instructions on how to obey the commandment. So the essay very much sets on the table that polygamy revelation was kind of unclear, but there is a very specific revelation that states in Doctrine and Covenants, behold, mine house is a house of order, says the Lord God, and not a house of confusion. So that's in Doctrine and Covenants 132 verse 8. That same section then begins the revelation about polygamy, saying, therefore prepare thy heart to receive and obey the instructions which I'm about to give unto you. And then there is a very clear and precise set of instructions. As the most confusing, difficult, controversial commandment, you would believe that with this belief system that God's house is a house of order, that for something so difficult, he would give a very clear and orderly set of instructions. Now, there are specific instructions about things like mission callings, the buying and selling of property, the exact amounts that people should be investing into the Nauvoo house, the exact time that the temples needed to be built by. The problem is that Joseph didn't follow this set of instructions that were in the Revelation. The actual words in D&C 132 are very clear on how polygamy was to be practiced. In 132, it states that Joseph was to marry only virgins, which is in verses 61 to 62. However, the essay later admits that Joseph's wives were polyandrous, so they were simultaneously married to other men and of course not virgins. Some of his wives were actually pregnant with children when they were married. And it also very clearly specifies that polygamy can only be practiced when the first wife accepts the polygamous marriage. Meaning that Emma Smith, his first wife, would need to not only accept, but help bring in the further wives. And Emma did not know about a lot of these marriages. She knew about the revelation and she did not like it. And in D&C 132, it explicitly declares that if Emma got in the way of polygamy, that she would be destroyed. Just very strong language. So the essay says that there were no exact instructions, but in D&C there are very exact instructions. They just weren't followed. It then goes on in the essay to say significant social and cultural changes often include misunderstandings and difficulties, and that church leaders and members experience these challenges as they heeded the command to practice plural marriage again later as they worked to discontinue it after church president Wilfred Woodruff introduced an inspired statement known as the Manifesto in 1890, which led to the end of plural marriage in the church. So that's the church essay. This historically does not match. The Manifesto was a claim to the outside world because of the illegality that plural marriage had. So the church came out with this manifesto. However, there are very clear records that plural marriage continued up until 1904. What are those records? They are first-hand records of the people practicing it. And even up until 1920, there were occasional authorized polygamous marriages. Now, there is an entire sect of Mormonism that broke off from the Mormon Church, known as the FLDS, and other sects that wanted to continue even past this point, and still are continuing to this day the practice of plural marriage. So people felt very, very, very strongly about continuing this. So as much as, in 1890, the Manifesto was released, but there are records that it continued up until 1920. Moving on with the essay. Many details about the early practice of plural marriage are unknown. Plural marriage was introduced among the early saints incrementally, and participants were asked to keep their actions confidential. They did not discuss their experiences publicly or in writing until after the Latter-day Saints had moved to Utah. So they moved across the plains, which is, again, a whole, probably another episode. And church leaders then publicly admitted to the practice. So this is very important because Joseph Smith did not record the revelation he received until 1943, 10 years after the practice. So he was practicing polygamy for 10 years until he actually recorded the revelation about it. He also kept, as I've mentioned, this information secret from his wife, Emma. And many early church leaders, such as Oliver Cowdery, had heard nothing on polygamy. And so therefore assumed, because he witnessed that Joseph Smith was having an affair with Fanny Alger, who we'll talk about. Now, Oliver Cowdery called this a dirty, awful affair. I will not make a comment on that. The historical record of early plural marriage is therefore thin. this is back to the essay. Few records of the time provide details. There are a lot of records. We have a lot of history. We have historical facts, and as the historical capabilities are increasing in scholarship, in archaeology, in the historical sects, more and more is being found. So there's a lot of facts. So the next segment in the essay talks about how it assimilates Joseph Smith to Old Testament prophets, and that he was simply bringing back the practice that had been practiced in older times. It's believed that, as mentioned, the practice of polygamy with Joseph Smith started in 1831. Again, he would not announce the revelation till 10 years or over 10 years later. He was being accused of polygamy in his early 30s due to his affair with his 16-year-old live-in maid, Fanny Alger. Now, I mention her age because she was underage. She was 16. At this point in time, Joseph Smith was in his 30s. So she was an underage girl, and there is a very, very common thought pattern that to be married off at 16 in the 1800s was normal, which is not true. So in the 1800s, the median age of females being married was 23 years old. So it was very much it was taboo then, as it is now. Other estimates are between the ages of 20 to 23, and then there's also a census a US census that dates it even older at a median age of 26 for females. So being married at 16 was not normal whatsoever. It's just as odd today as it was back then. With Fanny Alger, no marriage records existed. This is very secret at this point, to the point where Oliver Cowdery, one of Joseph Smith's closest confidants, did not know about it. He thought it was an affair. There was also accusations of other incidences besides Fanny Alger. For instance, the famous mob attack in which Joseph was tarred and feathered was led by one of the Johnson brothers. Now, the Johnson brothers was fueled by the accusation that Joseph had been indecently involved with their little sister. Now, it's significant that within that attack of him being tarred and feathered by the brother and father of this young girl, in which they believed that Joseph had assaulted sexually, and that's what led to the tar and feathering of him. They actually brought him in that attack to a doctor to actually castrate Joseph. That was their goal. Because in these times, that behavior was dealt with by castration. This is back to the essay, people who knew Joseph well later stated that he received the revelation at this time to be marrying these young girls. So the people that are referred to here are W.W. Phelps, Oliver Cowdery, and 5 other men who received instruction for their missions to the American native people. they were, how do I say this? They were told that the wives of the Lamanites and Nephites, which are the characters from the Book of Mormon, who they believed were the the predecessors of the Native American peoples, their prosperity should become white, delightsome and just in the form of genocidal breeding. That's really the correct term for it. This is not mentioned specifically in the essays because it's obviously horrifying. So the practice of plural marriage was given to the men that were going to missions, and they were allowed to take, as they wished, young girls, wives of Native American, of Native American descent. So then the revelation recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 132 states that Joseph prayed to know why God justified Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, and Solomon in having many wives. The Lord responded that he had commanded them to enter the practice. Here we have a problem again, in that God seemed to have changed his mind from the Book of Mormon, in obviously Jacob saying that these practices were evil in the Old Testament, and then turning around and saying to Joseph Smith that actually I want you to practice it. Again, I'll mention Jacob 2:24. Behold, David and Solomon truly had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord. And then in D&C 132, verse 38, David also received many wives and concubines, and also Solomon and Moses and my servants. There's also many other servants from the beginning of creation until this time, and in nothing did they sin, save in those things which they received not of me. Now, I try not to interject my personal experience with all this, but this particular scripture, D&C 132 versus Jacob 2:24, was a very confusing thing for me as a gospel doctrine teacher back when I was in the church. I remember having these two verses open next to each other and just being like, it was very odd and confusing. And then also obviously cross-referencing that with the Old Testament situation that didn't seem to fit. So they're directly, they're not, yeah. So Latter-day, this is back to the essay. Latter-day Saints understood that they were living in latter days in which the revelations called the dispensation of times, fullness of times. Ancient principles such as prophets, priesthood, and temples would be restored to the earth, and plural marriage was one of these principles. There is no biblical support for this concept. As I've just mentioned, in the Bible, God did not command men to take multiple wives. It's not a principle, but rather just a secular practice in some cultures that allowed men to expand their tribe. Okay, sorry, my battery decided to pass away. So let's pick up where we left off. So back to the article. The theme very much is that they are talking about historicity of polygamy, i.e. polygamy has been permitted for millennia in many cultures and religions, but with few exceptions, it was rejected in Western cultures. Joseph Smith's time, monogamy was the only legal form of marriage in the United States, and Joseph knew the practice of plural marriage would stir up public ire because it was just not, it was not legal. So he knew that, and legality is important because in Mormon doctrine, keeping the laws of the land is extremely important as a principle, and Joseph was blatantly breaking the law by practicing these plural marriages. I will save a lot of repetition, but essentially the essay goes on to sort of state that God gives difficult tasks, and in the pattern of Joseph essentially bringing young girls or women who had lost their parents or were in difficult situations, he would often bring them into their home to live as, you know, handmaidens or to assist with the household chores. And then he would basically let them know that he had received revelation that he needed to take them on as a wife. And if they did not agree to that, then he would be killed by an angel by a sword. That is pretty much common throughout all of the historical evidence of each and every woman that we have historical records for that were married to Joseph Smith. So the essay states that fragmentary evidence suggests that Joseph Smith acted on the angel's first command by marrying a plural wife, Fanny Alger, in the mid-1830s, but there is no marriage record of the marriage, and that is obviously the church admitting to Fanny Alger, the 16-year-old girl who was in this relationship, and several Latter-day Saints who had lived in Kirtland reported decades later that Joseph Smith had married Fanny Alger, who was their handmaiden, and that he had apparently obtained consent from her parents because she was only 16 years old. Many problematic issues there just in general, but I'm trying really hard not to insert my ethics as a modern woman in there. But there are details that appear decades later that were not available at this point in time. And there's no record that there's no evidence that the parents consented at all. There is no evidence that this was just not an affair. There was no evidence that this was a marriage by any means. Again, in the essay, it says that little is known about the marriage, but there is actually a lot known about the marriage from letters and journals of people that were heavily involved in the church. And nothing is known, this is the essay about the conversations between Joseph and Emma, except Emma, who had previously loved their live-in babysitter, housekeeper like a daughter, her own language, immediately kicked her out of the house upon discovering her relationship with Joseph. Now, this is the relationship that Oliver Cowdery described as a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. Now, this is in his Oliver Cowdery, who was Joseph Smith's right-hand man, the accusation that resulted in Oliver's excommunication. So when Oliver came out about how he felt regarding the affair with a 16-year-old girl, Fanny Alger, he got excommunicated. Now, Fanny was the first of many teenage girls that Joseph brought into his home as a servant or a helper, babysitter, or foster daughter, and then later married without Emma did not know this. I think this is a really overarching theme. She didn't know, nor did she approve, which, if we think to the rules set out in Doctrine and Covenants, the first wife is supposed to select and approve, but Emma did not know this. So, another example are the Partridge sisters. So they were a pair of sisters who Joseph and Emma took into their home as foster daughters after their father died. Now, Joseph married them both and was forced to marry them again in a mock wedding with Emma's knowledge. You'll remember that one of the rules set out in Doctrine and Covenants was, where was it? In Leviticus was that sisters cannot be married and mother and daughter cannot be married. But clearly this was not followed. Now, a lot of people have the misconception that whilst the marriages weren't legal, they were sealed. So they had a Mormon temple marriage and were sealed in the temple, and it was not a sexual relationship in any way, shape, or form. However, the sealing ordinance was not a part of the temple in Joseph's lifetime. What marriage then did he have with Fanny Alger? It was not a legal marriage because he was already legally married to Emma. And according to the laws of Ohio and the United States, this relationship was considered adultery. And as I said in the 12th article of faith, Mormons believe in obeying the law of the land. And again, this can't be a celestial marriage or a sealing because the Fanny Alger affair happened in 1833 to 1834, and the sealing power would not be restored until 1836 when Elijah came down as a spirit form, as the Mormon belief goes, to the Kirtland Temple. Now, let's talk about Sarah Ann Whitney, who was a 17-year-old teenage bride who married Joseph Smith with her parents' approval in trade for Joseph's promise of their eternal glory. So on August the 18th, several weeks after the marriage, Joseph wrote a letter to his new bride and their parents while he was in hiding because of legal issues. People were trying to imprison him in Nauvoo. And he says, "My feelings are so strong for you since what has passed lately between us. It seems as if I could not live long in this way, and if you three would come and see me, it would afford me great relief. I know it is the will of God that you should comfort me now in this time of affliction. The only thing to be careful of is to find out when Emma comes, then you cannot be safe. But when she is not here, there is the most perfect safety. Burn this letter as soon as you read it. Keep all locked up in your breasts. You will pardon me for my earnestness on this subject when you consider how lonesome I must be. I think Emma won't come tonight. If she don't fail to come tonight." We don't know how many letters were burned, but Sarah did not burn the letter, obviously, because we still got it. So I'm going to deviate. You can go and read the essay for yourself. Obviously, you won't have the commentary, but the overall theme of the essay is to sort of state that there is some biblical precedence for plural marriage, which there just isn't. So now instead I'm going to talk about some of the plural wives and their experiences, because I think that that's important, that we give these women their voices back. This may be just the first of probably a part 1 to part 2. We're gonna go in alphabetical order. So we're going to start with Agnes Moulton Coolberth, who was sealed to Joseph on January 6th of 1842. So she was born on the 9th of July in 1808, the third of 8 children. Agnes joined the church in Boston, and she traveled to Ohio when she was, although she was 8 years older than Don Carlos Smith, the brother of the prophet. They wed on the 30th of July. 2 years later, they left for Missouri, where they stayed until they were situated in Nauvoo. So 5 months later, Joseph Smith was sealed to Agnes. So Brigham Young's journal for January 6, 1842 records, "I was taken to the lodge." Joseph Smith was Agnes's, italicized. The word "was" probably stands for wed and sealed. That contradictory evidence concerning... So in this video, I'm just going to sort of talk about a couple of the wives. I've talked a little bit about Fanny Alger. I would like to talk a little bit about the 14-year-old wife that Joseph took. Her name was Helen Ma Kimball. So she was the third child of Hubert Chase Kimball, and in 1832, Hubert, with Brigham Young, visited a branch of the church in Columbia, Pennsylvania, to investigate the teachings advanced there. 3 months later, Hubert was baptized, and 3 years later, he was called as one of the original members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, which was a very high status, and still is to this day, in the Mormon Church. Now, obviously, this is very controversial, because when Helen Ma Kimball's... controversy obviously is sparked around Helen Ma Kimball's plural marriage, because she was 14 at the time of the ceremony. Now, this is Helen's words. "With all the false traditions in which we were born, and in consequence of degenerate tide with which the human family has been drifting for generations past, and as the Lord and no organized priesthood on the earth, it is not to be wondered that in our ignorance of his ways, feelings, and natures should rebel against the doctrine of a plurality of wives. I remember how I felt, but which would be a difficult matter to describe, the various thoughts, fears, and temptations that flashed before my mind when the principle was first introduced to me by my father, who one morning in the summer of 1843, without any preliminaries, asked me if I would believe him if he told me that it was right for married men to take other wives. Can be better imagined than told, but suffice it to say, the first impulse was anger, for I thought he had only said it to test my virtue. My sensibilities were painfully touched. I felt a sense of personal injury and displeasure, for to mention such a thing to me, I felt altogether unworthy of my father, and as quick as he spoke, I replied to him in short and pathetically, no, I wouldn't. I had always been taught to believe in it a heinous crime, improper and unnatural, and I indignantly resented it. This was the first time that I ever openly manifested anger towards him, but I was somewhat surprised at his countenance, as he seemed rather pleased than otherwise. Then he commenced taking seriously and reasoned and explained the principle and why it was again to be established upon the earth. He did not tell me that anyone had practiced it, but left me to reflect upon it for the next 24 hours. The next day, the prophet called at our house, and I sat with my father and mother and heard him teach the principle, explain it more fully. I believed it, but I had no proof. only his and my father's testimony I thought sufficient and did not deem it necessary to seek for any further because she was 14. Okay, sorry, I've just had to change angles here for a moment because my camera keeps dying. Anyway, so as Helen declared her father brokeraged the union, apparently motivated by a desire to be related to Joseph Smith, the prophet. In another narrative, Helen explains that her father, Hubert C. Kimball, taught the principle of celestial marriage and had a great desire to be connected to Joseph Smith. And in her own words, I afterwards learned from the prophet's own mouth that this was... Richard Anderson observed, Helen says several times that her father took the initiative to arrange the marriage, and very possibly he did so with the view of committing her to the prophet before her budding social life produced a choice or a proposal from somebody else. And the second area of controversy involves whether or not the plural union was consummated. Now, it's clear that Helen's sealing to Joseph Smith prevented her from socializing as an unmarried lady. So this young girl at 14 had no option to find love, which is, I'm trying to stay objective, but it's really sad. Now, Helen penned a poem in 1881, and take this as you will. I thought through this life my time would be my own, the step I now am taking for eternity alone. No one need be the wiser, though time I shall be free, and as the past hath been, the future still will be. To my guileless heart, all free from worldly care, and full of blissful hopes of youthful visions rare, the world seemed bright, and threatening clouds were kept from sight, and all looked fair, but pitying angels wept. They saw my youthful friends grow shy and cold. The poisonous darts from slanderous tongues were hurled. Untaught the heart and generous sacrifice, thou didst not weigh the cost, nor know the bitter price. Thy happy dreams all over, thou'st doomed also be, barred out of society, seen by this destiny. And o'er the saddened memories of sweet departed joys, thy sickened heart will brood and imagine future woes. And like a fetter bird, with wild and longing heart, thou dallied pined for freedom and murmur at thy lot. After she wrote this poem, she elaborated that during the winter of 1843 there were lots of parties and balls, and some of the young gentlemen got up as a series of dancing parties and held the mansion once a week. And she was not allowed to go because she was married. And she states that she felt quite sore over it and thought it a very unkind act of her father to allow her brother to go and enjoy the parties, but did not allow her. Now, there is a woman named Catherine Lewis that reported Helen saying, I would never have been sealed to Joseph had I known it was anything more than a ceremony. Now, assuming this, people have taken this context to mean that it was never consummated. But while sexuality is a possibility, it's more likely an interpretation that the ceremony was preventing her from associating with friends. Anyway, there is a lot more to this, and there is a lot of, I wouldn't say evidence, but suggestive historical accounts that suggest that the marriage was consummated. I'm going to mark that as unknown to be, yeah, I'm going to mark that as unknown, but there is quite a lot of convincing evidence to say that it was. The last one for this episode is Zena Dietha Huntington, who was married when the prophet came to her and said that they should be married. She was 7 months pregnant with her husband, who she loved, with her baby. And she basically was told by the prophet that he'd received this revelation that she was to be one of his wives. She questioned that, being already married and 7 months pregnant with a baby. And he said, if you don't marry me, then an angel with a sword will come and slay me. So her and her husband decided that she needed to obviously marry the prophet. And she did. And there was an interview that was done with her by John W. White. Question: how then could you have been sealed to Joseph Smith without first having heard the doctrine of plural marriage? Answer: Joseph Smith sent my brother Dimmock to explain it to me. Question: is it a fact then that you were never taught it by Joseph Smith himself? Answer: my brother Dimmock told me that Joseph had told him. I knew it was from the Lord and I received it. Joseph did not come until afterward. Question: you mean by that then that after your brother Dimmock had returned to Joseph and given him the information that you accepted such teachings, that Joseph then came to you prior to having been sealed and taught you the doctrine of plural marriage? Answer: I told you that the Lord had revealed to Joseph that he was to marry me. I received it from Joseph through my brother Dimmock. Question: who was present at the time that Joseph taught you the doctrine of the sealing besides yourself and Joseph? Answer: my brother Dimmock. There is also some honestly heartbreaking letters from her husband about how he often thinks of her and their children, and it's heartbreaking because the children never actually knew that their father was their father. It was suppressed because after Joseph Smith's death, Zena was then passed to Brigham. So in early February 1849, Brigham stopped by, apparently unannounced, one Sunday evening and had a very agreeable visit. The next week, on the 13th of February, Zena for the first time invited Brigham to her home for supper. Zena does not mention seeing her husband again for a month. Then on the 15th, Brigham reappeared, and at this time she records briefly stayed the night. The next day, Zena prepared to move, evidently as a result of Brigham's instruction that she was now his. The diary entries of Zena and her husband, I can't read because I can't stay objective if I read those. Yeah, that's all. So if you are interested, there are biographies of a lot of Joseph's plural wives. Agnes M. Coolbrith, Almira Johnson, Delencia Johnson, sisters, Desdemonia Fulmer, Eliza Maria Partridge, Eliza Roxy Snow, Elizabeth Davis, Elvira Cowles, Emily Dow Partridge, Esther Dulcher, Fanny Alger, Fanny Young, Flora Ann Woodruff, Hannah Ellis, Helen Mar Kimball, Louisa Beeman, Lucinda Peddleton, Lucy Walker, Melissa Lott, Maria Lawrence, Marinda Nancy Johnson, Martha McBride, Mary Elizabeth Rollins, Mary Herron, Nancy Maria Winchester, Olive Gray Frost, Patty Bartlett, Prescindia Lathrop Huntington, Rhonda Richards, Ruth Vose, Sarah Ann Whitney, Sarah Kingsley, Sarah Lawrence, and Sylvia Sessingtons, and then Zena Huntington. This is the list of women that were plural wives of Joseph Smith that we have historicity, we have biographies, we have journal entries from these women. There is a website called josephsmithspolygamy.org that holds a great amount of resources of every single one of these women's experiences, how they were prospected, and if you wish, please let me know if you would like me to, I guess, go through the biographies of these women. You can just go to this website and read it yourself. I think that's where I'm gonna end today's video, because it's a bit of an emotional... I would just like to end this video by stating that as a believing member, I did not understand that Joseph Smith himself had plural wives. And I believed it all to be a lie and rumor. That's what I was taught. I also have had believing members say, so what if Joseph Smith had a 14-year-old wife? That doesn't bother me. I'm like, and that to me infuriated that particular instance with that believing member. Just, I acted very angrily, because I, at the age of 14, just couldn't imagine experiencing something like that. I think a lot of believing members are taught that this just is something that to degrade Smith's, I don't know, to degrade him as a person. However, it is historical, it did happen, the church has admitted that it's happened, and nothing in this video has been speculation or hate speech or anything like that. It's just the history, it's the biography of these women, and yeah, something to think about. I hope that you have learnt something in this video. Please leave comments, questions, other topics that you'd like me to cover. I will try to do so very objectively. And yeah, and if you have any objections to anything that I've sort of presented in this video, just let me know. I have, yeah, researched this quite thoroughly, so let me know if you think I'm wrong as well, because I'd love to hear your opinion. Thank you for watching. Lots of love to you guys. Would love it if you could subscribe and follow and click the bell and like and comment. That really helps my channel. Bye.